Hey guys, tonight we are traveling back in time to one of my favorite, and frankly, most unsettling eras, the Victorian age. Imagine, just for a moment, being dropped right into the middle of it. Not as a well-to-do gentleman with a pocket watch and a fabulous mustache, but as a young girl, probably around 12 or 13 years old, living in a respectable middle-class home. Your odds of survival, statistically speaking, aren't fantastic, so good luck with that. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're at it, I'd love to know where you're listening from tonight. Drop your city and the current time in the comments below. It's always cool to see how far these stories travel. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Alright, take a deep breath. Except you can't, can you? Not a full, deep, satisfying one. The first thing you notice is the pressure. It's a constant, unyielding hug around your ribs, pushing your organs into places they weren't designed to go. It's your corset, laced up tightly by your mother or a maid every single morning. It's not just for special occasions, it's your daily uniform. It's a physical reminder of your place in the world, to be contained, to be shaped, to hold a very specific, upright, and rigid posture. It's the first layer of the beautiful cage you inhabit. Your world is quiet and dim. Sunlight is considered a bit vulgar, something that fades the expensive velvet curtains and the intricate patterns on wallpaper. So the heavy drapes are almost always drawn, leaving the rooms in a perpetual twilight, illuminated by the soft, flickering glow of gas lamps that is gently in the background. The air is thick with the smell of coal smoke from the fireplace, beeswax polish from the heavy mahogany furniture, and perhaps the faint, cloying scent of potpourri trying to mask the general dampness of an English house. You are expected to be the angel in the house. This was a very real and powerful ideal of the time, popularized by a famous poem. It means you are the moral center of the family. Your purpose is to be pure, pious, gentle, and utterly selfless. You are not meant to have strong opinions, wild ambitions, or a loud laugh. Your energy is to be directed inward, toward domestic arts and spiritual refinement. Your days are a slow, predictable rhythm of needlepoint, practicing sentimental tunes on the pianofortunes, reading religious tracts, or perhaps a heavily abridged, morally sound novel. There is no running, no shouting, no getting your dress dirty. Your entire existence is a performance of delicate, respectable femininity, and in this world, even death is a performance. This brings us to a rather peculiar little detail of Victorian life: their relationship with mourning. It wasn't just sad, it was an elaborate public art form. When someone died, especially a child, the grief was showcased. Families would sometimes pose for portraits with their recently deceased loved ones, propping them up on chairs as if they were merely sleeping. It was called post-mortem photography, a way to have one last image, one final keepsake. It sounds morbid to us, but for them it was a tender, if unsettling, act of remembrance. It highlights how life, death, and piety were all tangled up in a public spectacle. You drift through your days in this silent, orderly house. You see your father when he comes home from his work in the city. You see your mother as she manages the household with a quiet, steely authority. You are loved, you are cared for, you are safe. But you are also utterly, profoundly bored and powerless. Your future is already mapped out. You will be educated just enough to be a charming conversationalist, and then you will be married off to a suitable young man. Currently being shaped by the corset is not truly your own. It is an asset, a vessel to be preserved in a state of purity for your future husband. Historians are still fiercely debating just how much women of your class really felt oppressed by these constraints. Was it a constant, simmering resentment bubbling beneath the surface of polite smiles and perfect posture? Or did many find genuine comfort, identity, and a sense of purpose within this rigid framework? It's a difficult question to answer from our modern vantage point. For some, this structure was a source of security. For others, it must have felt like slowly suffocating. The original, its complicated relationship status, but with an entire social order. So here you are, in your quiet room, with your embroidery plying in your lap, The world outside is a distant trumble of carriages and street vendors. The world inside is a silent, velvet-lined box. You have no voice in your own future, no control over your finances, no say in the grand scheme of things. Your body itself is subject to the will of fashion and family. In this landscape of profound powerlessness, you might start to wonder, what is the one thing, the only thing, you can truly control? And so, sitting there at the heavy oak dining table, surrounded by the clinking of heavy silverware on fine china, the answer presents itself. It's sitting right in front of you, a plate piled high with roasted meat, gravy-soaked potatoes, and boiled greens. It's sustenance. It is your mother's love and your father's provision made manifest, and it is the one thing you can, without a single word, refuse. So you do. You don't make a scene. You don't make a scene. You don't declare a hunger strike. You simply lay your fork down, fold your hands in your lap, and say quietly, "I'm not hungry. Thank you." At first it's met with gentle chiding. "Nonsense, dear. You must eat to keep your strength up." Your mother's brow furrows with concern. Your father peers at you over his spectacles, a silent, authoritative gaze, but you hold firm. Quietly, respectfully, but firmly. This small act of passive defiance sends a ripple through the quiet order of the house. The next day you do it again. Then the next. Concern blossoms into genuine worry. The family doctor is called. He prods you, peers into your eyes, listens to your chest with a cold stethoscope, and diagnoses you with a touch of female hysteria or perhaps a nervous disposition. Common catch-all terms for almost any ailment a woman might have that baffled the male medical establishment. Fresh air but not too much, and perhaps a foul-tasting tonic. But still, you do not eat. And here is where something strange begins to happen. Your refusal, your quiet, persistent self-denial, starts to be interpreted through a different lens. Not sickness, but purity. In an age drenched in religious sentiment, the idea of fasting for spiritual reasons was not alien. It had a deep historical precedent. For centuries, female saints and mystics, particularly in the Middle Ages, had practiced extreme fasting as a way to conquer the sins of the flesh and draw closer to God. They believed that by denying the body, they were nourishing the soul. Their emaciated frames were seen not as a sign of illness, but as a radiant symbol of their devotion. This historical memory was still alive and well in the Victorian consciousness. And so your simple "I'm not hungry" starts to be whispered about in a different way. You're not just a picky eater. You're not just a sickly girl. Perhaps you are so pure, so untainted by worldly desires, that you no longer require earthly sustenance. There's a fascinating term historians use for this phenomenon, borrowed from the study of medieval saints: anorexia mirabilis, or miraculous lack of appetite. It wasn't seen as a disorder but as a divine gift. The miracle wasn't that you chose not to eat, the miracle was that God had taken your very appetite away, freeing you from the base, animalistic need for food. This reframing is everything. It transforms a deeply worrying behavior into a holy spectacle. Your body begins to change. The corset feels looser. Your face grows paler, more delicate. Dark circles appear under your eyes, which seem to grow larger and more soulful in your thinning face. You are becoming ethereal, otherworldly. You are confined to your bed now, to eat, to walk, but this confinement becomes its own kind of throne. Your bedroom, once a simple girder space, starts to feel like a shrine. Your weakness is reinterpreted as fragility, your lethargy as a serene meditative state. You have, unwittingly or not, turned your own body into a prison. A beautiful, tragic, sacred prison. The bars of this cage are your own ribs, becoming more prominent each day. But from within this prison, you wield a new and astonishing power. You are no longer just the quiet, obedient daughter. You are a mystery, a source of awe, a living testament to faith in a world increasingly grappling with the doubts of modernity and science. Your suffering has become your currency. The fundamental debate that still rages among scholars is about your intent. Were you, the fasting girl, a conscious strategist? Did you recognize the immense cultural power of piety and cleverly manipulate it to escape an arranged marriage or the crushing boredom of domestic life? Or was this a far more tragic, subconscious process, a genuine manifestation of psychological distress, an eating disorder that your society, lacking the language of modern psychiatry, could only understand in the language of miracles? Was it a power move, or a desperate cry for help that was tragically misinterpreted? For now, that question hangs in the air of your dimly lit room. You are no longer hungry. You are no longer bored. You are a body humming with a strange new power, a story waiting to be told, and outside your bedroom door, the first whispers have already begun. The first time you refuse your dinner, it is a quiet, personal revolution. A tremor only you can feel. The second and third time, it becomes a family problem, a wrinkle in the domestic fabric. By the second week, it has become a full-blown crisis, a storm contained within the walls of your respectable home. Your mother alternates between pleading and weeping, trying to tempt you with spoonfuls of beef broth or sweetened milk, her face a mask of anxious love. Your father's initial stern silence gives way to frustrated lectures on duty, health, and the embarrassment you are causing the family. But you have discovered a strange, unyielding strength in your weakness. Your no is a silent, unreachable fortress. They can't force the food down your throat without resorting to a violence that is unthinkable in your polite Christian household. So they are at an impasse. And you, lying pale and still in your bed, are in complete control. For the first time in your life, you hold all the cards. The doctor comes and goes, shaking his head, his bag of tonics and theories proving useless against your placid refusal. He suggests sending you to the seaside for the restorative air, or to a sanatorium, but the very idea is scandalous. To send a young lady away from her home suggests a problem too great for the family to manage, a public admission of failure. So you remain, a quiet, stubborn enigma in your own bedroom. Then, one afternoon, your mother's friend comes to call. A woman from the church, known for her intense piety. She sits by your bedside, not with a Bible. She doesn't talk about food. She talks about saints. She speaks of Catherine of Siena, who subsisted on nothing but the Eucharist. She whispers about the blessings of those who suffer for their faith. And as she looks at you, at your pale skin and luminous eyes, her gaze is not filled with worry. She leaves your house and the story changes. She doesn't tell people that the doctor's daughter is worryingly ill. She whispers with a thrill of reverence that the doctor's daughter is special, that she seems to be living on prayer alone. It's a tiny spark, but it lands on the bright tinder of a community hungry for wonder. This is a time of immense change and anxiety. Darwin has published his theories, shaking the very foundations of faith. Factories are churning out new technologies at a dizzying pace. The world feels like it's speeding up, becoming more complicated, more godless. A story about a simple girl in a quiet town who has transcended the basic needs of the flesh. It's an antidote to the anxieties of the age. It's a comforting, miraculous tale that reaffirms the old ways and the power of faith. And here's a quirky little detail about how information reveled back then. It was the golden age of the calling card. A respectable lady's afternoon was a carefully choreographed ritual of visiting other ladies, leaving a small, engraved card on a silver tray in their entryway. It was the Victorian equivalent of a social media, like or poke. And with every card left, with every cup of tea poured, your story was shared, embellished, and amplified. It became the town's most precious piece of gossip, passed from parlor to parlor in hushed, excited tones. The family's reaction begins to pivot. Your mother's frantic worry doesn't disappear, but it's now mixed with a strange, hesitant pride. Could it be true? Is her daughter not sick, but blessed? It's a far more palatable narrative than my daughter is starving herself for reasons we cannot comprehend. Your father, a man of science and logic, is deeply skeptical, but he also sees the shift in how the community perceives his family. The initial embarrassment is being replaced by a kind of revered curiosity. He is no longer the father of a difficult child, he is the guardian of a local wonder. Historians often debate the precise moment a family becomes complicit in the fasting girl phenomenon. Is it a conscious decision, a family meeting where they decide to lean into the miracle narrative for social gain? Or is it a much more subtle, gradual slide, a process of self-deception born from a desperate need to make sense of a terrifying situation. It's likely the latter. It's easier to believe in a miracle than to confront the terrifying possibility that your child is willfully self-destructing in a way that you are powerless to stop. So the family narrative shifts. She has no need for food, your mother might say to a visitor. A tremor of something unreadable in her voice. Is it pride? Fear? Confusion? The Lord provides all the sustenance she requires. You, in your bed, hear these words. You see the awe in the eyes of visitors. You are no longer a problem to be solved. You are a mystery to be revered. And the initial act of refusal has now bloomed into a full-blown identity, one that is being co-authored by your family and your entire community. The private revolution is about to go public. The whispers have a life of their own now. They seep out from under the door of your respectable house, carried on the afternoon breeze along with the scent of your mother's prize-winning roses. They drift over garden fences, or exchanged over shop counters, and become the topic of hushed conversation after the Sunday sermon. Your name, which was once just a name, is now a title, the fasting girl of Aber whatever. You've gone from being a person to being a phenomenon. The story morphs as it travels. In the beginning it was, the doctor's daughter isn't eating. Then it became, they say the doctor's daughter lives on prayer. Now the embellishments begin. Someone swears they saw faint, holy light emanating from your window at night. Another claims that the flowers in your sick room never wilt. You are said to spend your days in a state of serene, prayerful trance, occasionally uttering cryptic, poetic phrases about angels and heaven. Every retelling adds another layer of myth, another coat of miraculous varnish, until the real you, the tired, hungry, and probably quite miserable girl in the bed, is almost entirely obscured. You are no longer just a local curiosity, you are becoming a piece of local pride. Your small town, which has nothing else to distinguish it from 100 other small towns, now has you. It has a miracle. People begin to feel a sense of collective ownership over your story. You are their fasting girl. This gives them a sense of importance, a connection to the divine. And you in your bed become a performer. You may not have consciously decided to be one, but the role has been thrust upon you, and you learn your lines quickly. You learn to keep your eyes half closed, to give the impression of being in a state between this world and the next. You learn to speak in a soft, weak voice, which is easy enough as your strength genuinely wanes. You fold your hands piously over the blanket. When visitors are ushered into your room, you are the very picture of saintly suffering. They don't see a starving child, they see what they want to see, a living icon. Let's talk about a fascinating aspect of Victorian culture that feeds directly into this, the cult of the invalid. Being chronically ill, especially for a woman of a certain class, was always seen as a tragedy. It could be a kind of terror. The delicate, sofa-bound invalid was a romantic figure. She was freed from the drudgery of domestic duties. She was the center of the household's attention and sympathy. Her weakness was her power. People would come to her, bring her small gifts, read to her, and seek her gentle wisdom. You haven't just stumbled into a religious narrative, you've also perfectly slotted into a powerful social one. You are the ultimate invalid, the queen of the sick room. The first strangers start to arrive. Not friends of the family, but people from neighboring villages who have heard the rumors. A farmer and his wife, dressed in their Sunday best, stand awkwardly in your doorway. Their faces a mixture of awe and fear. The wife presses a few coins into your mother's hand. For the poor, she says, but everyone knows it's an offering. It's payment for the privilege of witnessing a miracle. A new and deeply uncomfortable dynamic enters the house. Your piety is becoming profitable. This is the point where historians get into heated arguments about the family's motives. Was this the moment the parents crossed a line from passive believers to active promoters? Or were they simply caught in a current too strong to swim against? To refuse these visitors would be seen as prideful, as hiding a gift from God. To accept their offerings felt wrong, but also necessary. A little extra money could help. Perhaps they justified it as donations for the church, or for your care. The line between piety and profit begins to blur, and once it blurs, it's very hard to see clearly again. So the performance solidifies. The whispers have built you a stage. Then the expectations of your audience provide the script. You are no longer simply refusing food out of a complex personal need. You are now fulfilling a public role. The miracle is no longer a private family matter. It's a community enterprise. And with every visitor who leaves your room with a story to tell, your fame grows. But the walls of your prison-lit bedroom, that role, that starving body also grow a little higher, a little stronger. The girl who just wanted some measure of control is now trapped by the very miracle that gave her power. The trickle becomes a stream, and then the stream becomes a steady, shuffling river of humanity flowing towards your front door. It's no longer just the curious neighbors or folks from the next town over. Now they come from further afield. They arrive on the newly constructed railways that are stitching the country together, turning a day's carriage ride into a manageable few hours' journey. Your quiet, respectable street is transformed. On any given afternoon, there's a small crowd gathered outside, speaking in low, reverent tones, hoping for a chance to get in. Your house, once a private sanctuary, has been reconfigured. The front parlor, with its stiff furniture and family portraits, is now a waiting room. Your mother, who once spent her days overseeing the polishing of silver, is now a gatekeeper, deciding who is worthy of an audience. Your father, a man of medicine, now comes home to find strangers in his hallway, their muddy boots soiling the runner. The entire rhythm of the household now revolves around you, and the pilgrimage you have inspired. Your bedroom is the main event. It's the Holy of Holies. People are ushered in, usually in small groups of 2 or 3. They tiptoe across the floorboards, their breath held tight in their chests. They gaze at you, lying pale and still under the counterpane. To them, you are a marvel, a direct link to the supernatural in their gritty, industrializing world. You are better than a ghost story, you are a living, breathing miracle. They don't come empty-handed. This is a crucial part of the ritual. They bring offerings, laying them on the small table beside your bed. It's a strange assortment. A devout farmer might leave a perfect, rosy apple, an ironic gift for a girl who doesn't eat. A woman might leave a small, hand-embroidered handkerchief. Some leave prayer cards. Others a few pennies or even a silver shilling. These small tokens accumulate, transforming your bedside table into a cluttered altar. This practice of leaving offerings has a long, long history, echoing medieval pilgrimages to saints' shrines. And here's a little side note on the economy of miracles. Relics and shrines were big business in the Middle Ages. A town's prosperity could rise or fall based on the popularity of its local saint's bones. In a way, you have become a living relic. Your family, whether they admit it to themselves or not, are the custodians of this new profitable shrine. They might insist it's for charity, or to buy you medicines which you don't take, or simply to help with the cost of having so many visitors. But it's there, a quiet, jingling reminder of the tangible benefits of your ethereal state. What do these pilgrims want from you? They want to see. They want to believe. Some of them are desperate. A mother with a sick child might ask for your prayers. A man facing financial ruin might hope that just being in your presence will bring him a bit of luck. They look to you for comfort, for a sign that there is more to this life than hardship and toil. You, in turn, provide what they need. You don't have to do much. You might offer a weak smile. You might offer a weak smile. You might offer a weak smile. You might let them touch the edge of your blanket, as if it were the hem of a saint's robe. Sometimes you might whisper a line from a hymn or the Bible, words you've heard 1,000 times in church. Your weakness makes the words seem profound, as if they are being channeled from another world. The academic world still tussles with the psychology of these crowds. Were they gullible fools, easily duped by a simple trick? Or is that too simplistic? Perhaps it's more accurate to say they were active participants in creating the miracle. They needed to believe in you so badly that they filled in all the blanks themselves. They projected their own hopes, fears, and faith onto your silent, starving form. It was a collective act of will. They weren't just observing a miracle, they were helping to sustain it with their belief. And so, day after day, the procession continues. Your world has shrunk to the 4 walls of your room, yet it has also expanded to include the hopes and dreams of hundreds of strangers. You are more famous than you have ever been and more trapped. The girl who started this journey is buried deep beneath the weight of all this adoration. The house is no longer a home, it's a destination. And your bed is no longer a place of rest, it's a stage. Your life is now a theatrical production, and you are the star, director, and stage is your four-poster bed, draped with white linens to accentuate your pallor and purity. The costume is a simple, high-neck nightgown, always immaculately clean. The lighting is the perpetually dim, reverent twilight of your curtained room, and the performance runs every afternoon for a select paying audience. You have mastered the art of holy languor. You know how to arrange your limbs in a pose of serene exhaustion, one hand resting delicately on your chest, the other lying limply on the coverlet. You've learned that a slow, deliberate blink can seem profound, as if you are gazing at visions unseen by mortal eyes. You time your shallow breaths to be almost imperceptible. This isn't about grand gestures, it's about a powerful, captivating stillness. The script is minimal but crucial. When visitors ask you questions, you reply in soft, cryptic fragments. Do you feel any pain? One might ask. You could reply, my bread is the Lord, a response that is both pious and evasive. Are you truly sustained by God's love alone? Another might inquire. A slow, beatific smile is your answer. It's frustratingly brilliant. You confirm everything without ever confirming anything at all. You have become fluent in the language of sacred ambiguity. This performance extends to your family. They are now the supporting cast, each with a specific role. Your mother is the emotional guardian of the miracle. She flutters around the room, dabbing your brow with a damp cloth, her face a perfect blend of maternal concern and holy pride. She is the one who tearfully recounts the story of how your appetite first vanished, how the doctors were baffled, and how you came to be in this blessed state. Her performance lends authenticity to the entire affair. Your father is the reluctant, scientific witness. He might stand in the corner, arms crossed, his expression somber. When pressed, he will admit that as a man of medicine, he cannot explain it. It is beyond my understanding, he might say. This is a masterstroke. His skepticism, seemingly overcome by the evidence before him, is more convincing than 100 sermons. He is a curious piece of Victorian stagecraft that has a strange parallel here, the tableau vivant, or living picture. It was a popular parlor game and form of entertainment where people would dress up and pose in a silent, motionless scene, often recreating a famous painting or historical event. The goal was to hold the pose for as long as possible. In a way, your entire life has become a tableau vivant. The scene is the dying saint, and you hold the pose, day in and day out. Because the moment the illusion of stillness is broken, the magic will shatter. The pressure to maintain this performance is immense. You are constantly being watched, not just by the daily parade of pilgrims, but by your own family. Your identity and newfound status depend on your commitment to the role. What if you suddenly felt a pang of hunger? What if you let out a very human, very unsaintly sigh of boredom? Every tiny, spontaneous gesture is a risk. You must police your own body, your own expressions with an iron will. There's a deep, unresolved debate among historians and psychologists about the level of conscious artistry involved. Was this a calculated, cynical deception performed for fame and fortune? Or was it something more complex? Some scholars argue for a state akin to a dissociative disorder. Perhaps you, the girl, so fully inhabited the role of the saint that you began to believe itself. The performance became your reality. The persona of the fasting girl consumed the person you used to be. You weren't just acting like a saint in your own mind, you were wine. The line between the performer and the role might have dissolved completely. So you lie there, a living work of art. You are the still center of a whirlwind of faith, hope, and burgeoning celebrity. Your every gesture is scrutinized, interpreted, and mythologized. You are an object of veneration. But the artist is also the canvas, and the canvas is slowly, painstakingly being destroyed. The performance of Saint Lines is a masterpiece of control, but it is also an act of slow, methodical self-erasure. The gas lamps are turned down low, casting long dancing shadows on the flocked wallpaper. The house is finally quiet. The last of the day's pilgrims has departed, their footsteps fading down the street. Your mother has looked in on you one last time, smoothing your blankets and whispering a prayer before retreating to her own exhausted sleep. Your father is likely in his study, surrounded by his medical texts, perhaps nursing a glass of portent, the gnawing cognitive dissonance of his life. For the first time in 12 hours you are truly, completely alone, and you are ravenous. The hunger is not a gentle pang, it's a physical, agonizing presence. It's a hollow ache in your stomach, a cramping in your gut. It makes you lightheaded and weak. The serene, otherworldly saint of the afternoon is gone, replaced by a desperate, starving child. This is the other side of the miracle, the part no one sees, the part that can't be acknowledged. Very carefully you slide your legs out of bed. Your muscles tremble from a combination of weakness and adrenaline. The floorboards are cold against your bare feet. Every creak of the old house sounds like a cannon shot in the silence. You move like a ghost through the familiar darkness of the hallway, your senses on high alert. You are not just moving through your home, you're on a secret, desperate mission. Your destination is the larder, the heart of the house's sustenance. You push open the heavy wooden door and the smells hit you first, the earthy scent of potatoes in a sack, the sharp tang of aging cheese, the sweet aroma of yesterday's leftover bread. It's the scent of life, and it's almost overwhelming. Your hands shake as you reach for the prize. A small piece of a cold meat pie, a heat of bread, maybe a spoonful of jam stolen directly from the jar. It's not a meal, furtive act of survival. You don't chew, you cram the food into your mouth, swallowing it down as quickly as possible, terrified of being discovered. Each mouthful is a cocktail of profound relief and crushing guilt. This is the central, heartbreaking fraud of the fasting girl phenomenon. While some girls did tragically starve to death, many others, perhaps most, survived for months or even years by eating in secret. They became masters of deception, developing an ingenuity born of desperation. This brings us to a fascinating and rather sad little detail: the dumb waiter. Many large Victorian houses had these small, hand-operated elevators to move food from the kitchen in the basement up to the dining room. For a fasting girl, a dumb waiter could be a lifeline. A sympathetic sibling or a loyal maid could place a small parcel of food on the lift and send it up to your floor, a secret delivery system that bypassed the watchful eyes of the rest of the household. Food hidden in hollowed-out books, scraps passed through a loose floorboard, or morsels smuggled in the pockets of a visiting relative. The question of who knew is a fraught one, debated endlessly by historians. Did your parents know? It's almost impossible to believe they didn't at some level. They must have noticed the missing food, the crumbs under the bed, the slight, almost imperceptible shifts in your weight. But to acknowledge it would be to bring the entire, elaborate construction of the miracle crashing down. It would mean admitting their daughter was not a saint, but a liar, and that they themselves were not the guardians of a miracle, but the orchestrators of a fraud. So they engaged in a kind of collective denial. A don't ask, don't tell policy of the soul. They didn't see the evidence because they couldn't afford to. This psychological defense mechanism, this willful blindness, allowed the performance to continue. They could maintain their belief, their status, and their daughter's life, all by tacitly agreeing to look the other way. After a few frantic, stolen bites, the guilt sets in. You are a fraud, a hypocrite. You have accepted the worship of good, honest people under false pretenses. This secret eating doesn't just nourish your body, it poisons your soul. By day, you are a vessel of divine purity. By night, you are a creature of earthly appetites and deceit. You are living to this, and the strain of holding them together is beginning to tear you apart. You creep back to your bed, wiping the last of the crumbs from your lips, and arrange yourself back into the pose of the saint. The hunger has been quieted for another night, but the gnawing emptiness inside you has only grown deeper. The family home, once a symbol of middle-class respectability, now operates like a small, clandestine business. And in this business, every member of the family has a role to play, whether they acknowledge it or not. The miracle has become a collective project, a fragile enterprise held together by a web of shared secrets and unspoken agreements. Your mother is the public relations manager. She is the warm, welcoming face of the phenomenon. She greets the pilgrims at the door, her eyes shining with what appears to be a mixture of piety and sorrow. She has perfected the art of telling your story. She recounts its beginnings, her voice trembling at just the right moments, her narrative poised in poetless retellings. She is the primary guardian of the myth. But in the quiet moments, away from the visitors, her performance softened. When she brings a fresh glass of water you are allowed to drink, her hand might linger on yours for a second too long. Her eyes might hold a question she will never dare to ask. Does she tuck your blankets in at night with a little too much vigor, perhaps checking for crumbs without consciously admitting that's what she's doing? Her love for you is real, but it's now tangled up in this complex deception. And her complicity is a form of desperate, misguided protection. Your father is the skeptical, scientific pillar of the operation. His role is to be the man of logic who has been forced to surrender to a power beyond his comprehension. He is less involved in the day-to-day management of the pilgrims, often staying in his study or making his medical rounds. But his tacit approval is crucial. When a journalist or a fellow doctor questions him, his weary resignation, "I have observed my daughter closely. I have no medical explanation," is the most powerful endorsement of all. He is betraying his own scientific principles, a fact that surely erodes some part of his soul. Perhaps he justifies it by telling himself, "You are not physically ill in a way he can treat. So what harm is there in letting this play out, especially when it seems to bring you and the community a strange kind of comfort?" Then there are your siblings, if you have them. They are the silent, often overlooked, partners in this conspiracy. A younger brother might be resentful of the attention you receive, but also thrilled by the secret importance of his family. He might be the one who stands guard at the bottom of the stairs while you make a late-night foray to the kitchen. An older sister might be your most crucial ally. She could be the one who smuggles you leftovers, hiding them in her sewing basket. She might feel a mixture of pity, jealousy, and fierce loyalty. Your condition has completely upended the family dynamic, placing you at the center of a universe that once revolved around more normal, sibling-centric concerns. The central agonizing question for historians remains, were the parents villains or victims? Were they greedy exploiters of their own child, a 19th century version of manipulated stage parents? Or were they just as trapped as you were, caught in a web of public expectation and private desperation? The triad of Sarah Jacobs' parents, which we'll get to later, put this very question to a jury. The court of public opinion was and still is fiercely divided. Some see them as monstrously cruel, allowing their child to starve for the sake of notoriety. Others see them as tragic figures blinded by faith and a profound inability to understand the psychological forces at play, who loved their daughter, but were utterly incapable of saving her. The truth is likely somewhere in that messy, uncomfortable middle ground. They are not one thing, but many things at once: loving, fearful, proud, deceitful, pious, and greedy. They are co-authors of your sainthood and co-conspirators in your slow destruction. Every evening, as the family gathers for their dinner or meal, you are conspicuously performatively absent from the silence, and your empty chair speaks volumes. They eat, they talk, they maintain the fiction of a normal family life, all while the biggest secret of their lives lies in the room just upstairs, listening to the muffled sounds of their complicity. Eventually, the sheer persistence of your miracle begins to attract a different kind of visitor. Not the devout pilgrims with their humble offerings, but men with leather bags and skeptical frowns. The doctors. At first it's just your own family physician, returning with a renewed sense of professional duty, perhaps goaded by his colleagues or the local gossip. But soon word reaches more prominent medical men in the city, and they come to see this marvel for themselves. You are not a saint, you are a puzzle, a biological impossibility that challenges the very foundations of their scientific understanding. They arrive with an air of authority, their presence starkly different from the hushed reverence of the pilgrims. They don't see a holy shrine, they see a clinical case study. They fill your quiet room with the smell of carbol, soap and the rustle of notebooks. Their gazes are not awestruck, they are diagnostic. They peer at you, prod you, and discuss you in low, clinical tones as if you were a specimen under glass. The medical theories they propose are a wild tour through the landscape of 19th century medicine, a world teetering between ancient superstition and modern science. Some of the initial hypotheses are tinged with a kind of magical thinking that seems bizarre to us now. One popular theory, believe it or not, was that you were somehow absorbing sustenance from the air. They called it absorbing effluvia or miasma. The idea was that the atmosphere itself contained invisible nutritive particles, and that you in your special heightened state had developed the ability to live on this ethereal energy alone. It's science trying to explain a miracle by inventing another, slightly more scientific-sounding miracle. Another set of theories revolved around the popular diagnosis of hysteria. This was the great catch-all diagnosis for women in the Victorian era. The term itself comes from the Greek word for uterus, hysteria, as it was believed the condition stemmed from a wandering womb. Any symptom from anxiety and fainting spells to irritability and, yes, a loss of appetite could be chalked up to hysteria. The doctors would nod sagely, declare you a fascinating case of anorexic hysteria. Unprescribed treatments that ranged from the benignly useless-like rest cures to the frankly terrifying like hydrotherapy, which could involve being blasted with high-pressure jets of icy water. Then there were the more mechanically minded physicians. They were convinced you were a fraud, and they were determined to prove it. They would conduct meticulous examinations of your room, searching for hidden caches of food. They de-inspect the floorboards, tap on the walls, and scrutinize your bedding. They might try to trick you, leaving a tempting biscuit on your bedside table while pretending to be distracted, just to see if you take the bait. Your quiet bedroom becomes a battleground, a contest of wills between your saintly performance and their rationalist skepticism. This brings us to a weird and wonderful, if slightly gruesome, little piece of medical history: the Victorian obsession with weighing and measuring everything. In their quest for empirical data, scientists of the era would measure skulls, chart heights, and yes, meticulously weigh their subjects. A doctor investigating your case might insist on bringing a large, cumbersome scale into your room to weigh you daily. They believed the numbers on the scale would be the ultimate truth teller. If you were truly not eating, your weight would steady or, heaven forbid, increased. It was proof of deception. This turns your body into a piece of living data. The numbers on the scale, a verdict on your honesty. The academic debate here centers on the role of the medical establishment in these tragedies. Were they heroes of science, trying to debunk a dangerous superstition and save a child's life? Or were they just as much a part of the spectacle as the pilgrims, their public examinations, unpublished case studies contributing to the girl's celebrity and making it even harder for her to escape her role? Some historians argue that by engaging with the miracle on its own terms, even in an attempt to debunk it, the doctors inadvertently legitimized it. They turned a local folk tale into a national medical controversy, raising the stakes for everyone involved. So you lie there, enduring the cold stethoscopes, the probing questions, and the suspicious glares. You are caught between two powerful, competing narratives. To the pilgrims, you are a saint. To the doctors, you are a liar or a lunatic. Both sides project their own worldview onto your silent, wasting body, and neither seems to see you for what you truly are: a girl, trapped in a nightmare of her own, and her culture's making. The doctor's visits, with their skeptical reports and published case notes, do something the local whispers never could. They elevate your story from a regional curiosity to a national sensation. It's one thing for a country parson to believe in a miracle, it's another thing entirely for prominent men of science to be publicly baffled. This apparent conflict between faith and reason is journalistic gold. Suddenly, your name and your story are being carried far beyond the reach of the railways. They're being printed in the penny press, the cheap, mass-produced newspapers that are exploding in popularity across the country. These papers thrive on sensationalism, and you are the perfect subject. A single reporter, perhaps from a London paper, makes the journey to your small town. He interviews your mother, gets a few gruff words from your father, speaks to the awestruck villagers, and maybe even gets a brief theatrical audience with you. The article that appears a few days later is a masterpiece of Victorian melodrama. It's accompanied by a dramatic, full-page woodcut illustration. The artist has likely never seen you, but that doesn't matter. They depict you as a tragic, beautiful angel with huge, soulful eyes and long, flowing hair spread across the pillar. You look ethereal, holy, uncaptivating life rail. The headline is Bold and Breathless Sleeping Saint of Somerset, or a Living Miracle, Medical Science Baffled by the Fasting Maid of Kent. You are now, in modern terms, a viral celebrity. People who will never meet you, who live hundreds of miles away, know your name. They discuss your case over their breakfast tables. Your illustrated portrait is cut from the newspaper and pinned to the wall in workshops and kitchens. You have become public property, a character in a national drama. This media exposure changes the nature of the pilgrimage. The crowds outside your house grow larger and more diverse. They're no longer just the local devout. Now you get curiosity seekers from the cities, thrill seekers, amateur sleuths hoping to catch you in the act of eating, and even other journalists, all wanting their own piece of the story. Your family has to institute a more formal system, perhaps even issuing tickets for admission. The line between shrine and sideshow becomes vanishingly thin. Let's pause on a fascinating, and slightly smelly, aspect of Victorian cities that fueled this hunger for pure stories. The cities were experiencing what was called the Great Stink. The Thames River in London, for instance, was effectively an open sewer, and in the hot summer months, the smell was so overpowering it was a national crisis. The city was seen as a place of filth, corruption, and disease. A story like yours, coming from the pure countryside, about a girl who had seemingly transcended the messy, base needs of the body, was the ultimate escapist fantasy. You were the spiritual and physical opposite of the grimy, chaotic, stinking reality of modern urban life. The fame is a double-edged sword. On one hand, it solidifies your power and your family status. You are not just a local wonder anymore, you are a national figure. Offers might come in from entrepreneurs and showmen like the famous P.T. Barnum, who would love to display you in his Museum of Curiosities. Your family would, of course, reject these offers with public indignation, claiming you are not an exhibit, but the offers themselves are a testament to your market value. On the other hand, the intense scrutiny is terrifying. With national fame comes national skepticism. Letters to the editor are published, calling you a humbug and your parents charlatans. More serious medical journals take up the case, debating the physiology of starvation and the psychology of deception. The pressure to maintain the illusion is now monumental. A single slip-up would not just lead to local embarrassment, it would lead to national disgrace. The academic controversy surrounding this aspect of the story is about media complicity. Were these newspapers just reporting a story, or were they actively creating and directing it? By choosing to frame you as a saint versus a fraud, they set the terms of the entire debate. They created a public spectacle that was incredibly difficult for anyone, especially a young girl, to back out of. It's argued that the media spotlight effectively sealed the fate of many of these girls. Once you were the fasting maid on the front page of a London paper, how could you ever go back to being just an ordinary girl who gets hungry? And so you lie in your bed, which now feels like the calm eye of a hurricane of your own creation. The world knows your name, but the person behind the name is fading fast. You are a brand, a headline, an illustration. You are a story being told about a girl, and it's a story that is rapidly spinning out of your control. Now, let's pull the camera back from your own personal, fictionalized experience and zoom in on a very real girl, in a very real place. Her story is, in many ways, the definitive tragic eye of the whole phenomenon. Her name is Sarah Jacob, and she lives in a tiny, remote farming community in Wales called Let her knew it. It's the late 1860s. Unlike your comfortable middle-class home, Sarah's world is one of rural poverty. She is one of 7 children born to Evan and Hannah Jacob, tenant farmers on a small patch of land. Their home is a simple, 2-room stone cottage, a world away from the velvet curtains and mahogany furniture of our story so far. But the core pressures are the same, just filtered through a different social lens. Their lives are governed by hard work, the changing seasons, and a deep, powerful, nonconformist Protestant faith. The story begins in a familiar way. When Sarah is about 10 years old, she complains of stomach pains after being ill with scarlet fever. She takes to her bed, and then she stops eating. At first, her parents are, of course, deeply worried, but Sarah is a profoundly religious child, known for her piety, her love of reading the Bible and writing about God, as weeks turn into months, and she continues to survive on seemingly nothing, the narrative begins to shift. The local vicar, a man of sincere faith, becomes a believer. He visits Sarah regularly and is captivated by her serene demeanor and pious pronouncements. He begins to speak of her as a marvel, a divine wonder. And the story, just like yours, begins to spread. It starts in their small Welsh-speaking community, a place where folklore and faith are deeply intertwined. The idea of a special child, blessed by God, is not a difficult one to embrace. Sarah's performance is, by all accounts, flawless. She lies in her bed, which is always decorated with ribbons and flowers, with a Welsh Bible resting on her chest. She is described as pretty and intelligent, with a calm, almost beatific expression. She writes religious poetry in letters to well-wishers. Her bedroom, in this humble stone cottage, becomes a pilgrimage site. Here's a specific, poignant detail that sets her story apart: her bed. It was reportedly placed in the main living area of the small cottage, not tucked away in a private bedroom. This meant she was constantly on display. Her life was lived out in the center of the family's daily existence, her performance of sainthood inseparable from the cooking, mending, and general business of a crowded farmhouse. There was no backstage for her to retreat to. The pilgrims arrive, just as they did for you. They come from all over Wales and England, trudging up the muddy lane to the small farm. They leave coins on her bedside table, which the family collects in a box. The Jacobs family insists the money is for Sarah, to be given to her if she recovers. But in the meantime, it helps keep the struggling farm afloat. The family's fortunes, which were once tied to the price of wool and grain, are now tied to the public's fascination with their starving daughter. The national press discovers her, and she is given a title that will stick with her forever: the Welsh Fasting Girl. The story has all the perfect ingredients: a poor but devout family, a beautiful and pious child, a remote and romantic rural setting, and a baffling medical mystery. She becomes an even bigger celebrity than you did. Illustrated newspapers run features, poems are written about her, and her name is known throughout Britain. But with this fame comes the same intense scrutiny. Doctors travel to Wales to examine her. Some come away convinced, or at least unwilling to call her a fraud. Others are deeply skeptical. They point out that her parents refuse to allow anyone to watch her continuously. They note that her younger sister, who sleeps in the same bed, could easily be passing her food in the night. The battle lines are drawn, just as they were in your story, between the believers and the skeptics. The academic debate about Sarah Jacob often focuses on the intersection of class, religion, and national identity. Was she seen as more authentically miraculous because she was a poor, Welsh-speaking girl from the countryside? To the English urban public, Wales was often romanticized as a land of ancient myth and deep, untainted spirituality. Did her Welshness make her story more believable, more potent? It's a compelling argument that her identity was just as much a part of the phenomenon as her fasting. Sarah Jacobs' story is so important because it's the case where all the elements we've talked about, family complicity, community belief, medical confusion, and media hype, converge and escalate toward a single dramatic and ultimately tragic conclusion. She is the focal point, the case study that would force a final, terrible confrontation between the world of faith and the world of science. Her quiet, flower-adorned bed in a Welsh farmhouse is about to become the stage for a fatal experiment. As Sarah Jacobs' fame swells, so does the weight of maintaining the illusion. Every newspaper article, every new pilgrim arriving at the farm raises the stakes. For you and our shared narrative, this is the phase where the joy of control could less into a constant, low-grade anxiety. The performance, which once felt empowering, now feels like a heavy cloak you can never take off. The skepticism is no longer just a few grumpy doctors, it's a public chorus. Letters pour into the newspapers. Some are from medical men who lay out the simple, brutal facts of human physiology. A person cannot survive for months, let alone years, without caloric intake. To suggest otherwise is to promote a dangerous, anti-scientific delusion. Others are from ordinary citizens, people who pride themselves on their common sense, who decry the whole affair as a popish superstition or a disgraceful humbug. They accuse your family of being greedy charlatans and you of being a cunning, deceitful actress. This public doubt creates a suffocating pressure. You start to see suspicion in everyone's eyes. Is the friendly visitor asking about your health really a believer, or are they a secret skeptic, looking for any tiny flaw in your performance? You police your own movements. Your intimate trips to the larder become fraught with a new level of terror. The risk of discovery is no longer just familial shame, it's public ruin. Your family feels the pressure too. They become defensive, almost hostile, to anyone who expresses a hint of doubt. They close ranks around you, their belief becoming more rigid and defiant in the face of opposition. Their public statements become more insistent. We have seen it with our own eyes. Your father might declare to a journalist, "She is sustained by a power we do not understand, but we do not doubt it." This defiance is a defense mechanism. To admit doubt now would be to admit they've been fools, or worse, liars all along. Here's a small but telling detail about Victorian social life: the obsession with reputation. For a middle-class family, reputation was everything. It was their social currency. A public scandal, an accusation of fraud, could destroy them. It could affect their credit with local merchants, their standing in the church, and the marriage prospects of their other children. So, protecting the miracle is no longer just about protecting you, it's about protecting you. It's about protecting you, it's about protecting the entire family's place in the world. The pressure to double down on the story is immense. This growing cloud of doubt forces the narrative to become more elaborate. To counter the skeptics, new elements might be added to your story. Perhaps you begin to exhibit other gifts. You might claim to exhibit other gifts. In the case of Sarah Jacob, she was said to be able to identify the contents of a visitor's pocket without looking. These small acts of supposed clairvoyance were meant to bolster the central miracle of fasting. Then why couldn't she live without food? It's an attempt to fight skepticism with more magic. The scholarly debate around this stage of the phenomenon often touches upon the concept of escalation of commitment. This is a psychological principle where people or groups, having invested heavily in a decision or a belief, will continue to support it and invest, even when faced with evidence that the belief is wrong. To back down would be to accept a loss, both psychological and social. So, instead, they escalate. The fasting girl and her family, trapped by their initial story, find themselves having to make it bigger and more incredible to keep it alive. It's a vicious cycle. The more people doubt, the more miraculous you have to become, and the more miraculous you become, the more unbelievable your story seems to the skeptics. You feel this cycle tightening around you like a python. The world is dividing into two camps, the faithful and the doubters. And you are stuck in the middle, a silent, starving symbol of their conflict. The pressure is building. The skeptics are no longer content to write letters to the editor. They are demanding proof, irrefutable, scientific proof. They want to eliminate all possibility of deception. And they have an idea of how to do it: a constant, uninterrupted watch. It's a challenge thrown down like a gauntlet. And for a family whose reputation is on the line, it's a challenge that is becoming increasingly difficult to refuse. The public back and forth between the believers and the skeptics reaches a fever pitch. The doubters, led by a faction of determined medical men, issue a formal challenge. They are tired of the anecdotal evidence, the tearful testimonies, the carefully managed viewings. They want an experiment. They propose scientific observation. They propose a constant, 24-hour watch to be conducted not by family or friends, but by impartial, professional observers. Their proposal is simple and logical. If Sarah Jacob can really survive without food, then such a watch will prove it to the world, silencing all criticism forever. If she cannot, it will expose the fraud. For Sarah's parents, this is the ultimate dilemma. To refuse the watch would be seen as a public admission of guilt. It would confirm the suspicions of every skeptic and be trumpeted in the newspapers as proof of their deception. Their reputation and Sarah's would be ruined. To accept the watch, well, they know on some deep, unspoken level what that means. It means cutting off the secret supply line that has kept their daughter alive for 2 years. This is where a crucial and tragic miscalculation occurs. Evan Jacob, Sarah's father, is a proud and stubborn man. Goaded by the public challenge and perhaps genuinely convinced of his daughter's special status, or at least convinced of her ability to withstand the ordeal for a short time, he agrees. He makes a bold, public statement. He invites the medical community to send their watchers. He declares, confident that his daughter's miracle is real and will stand up to any scrutiny. Fatal bluff. The local hospital in calm heart and agrees to provide the observers. They select for professional nurses from Guy's Hospital in London, a prestigious institution. These are not sentimental village women who can be charmed or distracted. They are trained, disciplined professionals, tasked with a single, clear objective: to watch Sarah Jacob unceasingly, and to ensure that no food or drink passes her lips. In early December 1816, the nurses arrive at the small, remote farmhouse. The atmosphere must have been incredibly tense. The nurses, with their crisp, clean uniforms and detached, professional demeanor, are an alien presence in the chaotic, emotional environment of the Jacob home. They set up a rota. At all times, day and night, at least one nurse, and usually two, will be in the room, their eyes fixed on the girl in the bed. You can imagine the scene. The family is pushed to the periphery. Their roles as guardians of the miracle are usurped by these clinical, silent observers. The pilgrims are turned away. The house falls quiet, but it is a heavy, anxious silence. Sarah lies in her bed, the stage she has commanded for so long. But the audience has changed. The adoring, believing faces have been replaced by the neutral, unblinking gaze of the nurses. A fascinating and heartbreaking detail from the historical accounts is the initial confidence of Sarah and her parents. For the first day or two, they seemed to believe they could weather the storm. Sarah maintained her performance of serene piety. Her parents bustled about, perhaps believing that the watch would only last a few days before the nurses gave up, or that a miracle really would happen. There's a powerful element of magical thinking at play, the idea that if you believe something hard enough, it will become true. But physiology does not bend to belief. The academic principle at work here is the simple, brutal reality of human metabolism, a reality the family had managed to ignore for 2 years. The body needs fuel. Without it, it begins to consume itself. The nurses simply had to sit and wait for this inevitable process to become apparent. They were not there to intervene, not to plead with her to eat, not to save her. They were there to observe and record. This transforms them from caregivers into something far more chilling. They are the passive, scientific witnesses to a slow-motion tragedy. The great, unresolved question that haunts this part of the story is what Sarah herself was thinking. Did she truly believe she could survive? Had she inhabited the role of the saint so completely that she believed her own myth? Or was she terrified, trapped by her father's pride and her own long-running deception, unable to ask for the food that would save her life because it would mean confessing everything? To ask for a piece of bread would be to destroy her family's honor, her own identity as a blessed child, and to admit she was a liar. And so, faced with an impossible choice, she chose silence. She lay there under the constant, unblinking watch of the nurses, and began, very quietly, to die. The first day of the watch passes in a tense, quiet stalemate. Sarah lies still, performing her usual role of the serene invalid. The nurses sit, watch, and take notes. Day 2 is much the same. To an outside observer, it might have seemed that the miracle was holding. Sarah's parents might have felt a flicker of triumphant hope. But the nurses, trained to observe the subtle signs of physical decline, would have noticed the small changes. By day 3, the mask of serenity begins to crack. The inexorable, biological reality of starves to assert itself. Sarah grows visibly weaker. The rosy tint in her cheeks, perhaps maintained by secret nourishment, fades to a waxy pallor. Her pulse becomes rapid and thread-wide. Her breathing grows shallow. She is no longer writing poetry or making pious pronouncements. She is listless, her eyes often closed, her body sinking deeper into the mattress. The nurses record these changes with clinical detachment in their logbook. Pulse 120 feeble, respiration shallow, appears much exhausted. They are following their orders to the letter. Observe, but do not interfere. The family, now frantic, hovers at the doorway. The father's arrogant confidence has evaporated, replaced by a growing panic. The mother is weeping, pleading with the nurses, with Sarah, with God. The quiet, controlled experiment has become a horrifying, slow-motion death watch in a tiny Welsh cottage. The visiting physician, Dr. Robert Fowler, who had been a key figure in organizing the watch, comes and goes. He sees the clear signs of starvation. He urges the parents to call an end to it, to give her food. But a terrible paralysis has set in. The parents, perhaps terrified of the legal and social repercussions of admitting their fraud, or still clinging to a desperate, last-ditch hope for a miracle, refuse to take charge. They beg Sarah to ask for food, shifting the responsibility onto the shoulders of their dying child. But for Sarah, admitting hunger now is an admission of guilt. It's too late. The performance has to be seen through to its terrible, logical conclusion. Here we encounter a truly grim piece of medical knowledge: the process of starvation. It's not just a feeling of hunger. The body, deprived of energy, starts to systematically break down its own tissues to survive. First fat reserves, then muscle. The heart muscle weakens, the immune system collapses, organ function begins to fail. It is a slow, painful, and wasting process. Sarah Jacob, at just 12 years old, is experiencing this cascade of systemic failure, all while under the watchful eyes of trained medical professionals. On the 8th day of the watch, December 17th, 1860, the end comes. Sarah is barely conscious. Her body is emaciated, her eyes sunken. She is cold to the touch. The local vicar is called to the bedside. He, the man who had been one of the first and most ardent promoters of her sainthood, now kneels by her bed and pleads with her to take a spoonful of wine. She refuses, or is perhaps too weak to respond. A few hours later, in the presence of her family and the impassive nurses, Sarah Jacob dies. The immediate aftermath is a scene of chaos and grief. The nurses' watch is over. They pack their bags and their logbooks, their grim task completed. The house is filled with the raw, agonized wails of her mother. The father is stunned into silence, the full weight of his catastrophic decision crashing down upon him. The miracle of the Welsh Fasting Girl has ended not with a divine ascension, but with a small, cold body in a flower and ribbon-adorned bed. The public spectacle, which had provided thrills, comfort, and income for 2 years, has culminated in the entirely predictable death of a child. The enduring academic question that arises from this specific, tragic end is one of professional ethics. The nurses and doctors involved argued they were acting in the interest of scientific truth, to debunk a dangerous superstition, but did their professional duty to observe override their human and medical duty to intervene? By agreeing to a watch, instead of insisting on immediate medical care, did they become complicit in her death? The case is still debated in medical ethics courses today. They successfully proved that a person cannot live without food, but the proof came at the cost of a young girl's life. The conflict between detached, scientific observation and compassionate intervention has rarely been thrown into such stark and tragic relief. The news of Sarah Jacob's death spreads like a shockwave, first through the valleys of Wales, then across all of Britain via the telegraph and the newspapers. The tone of the press coverage, which had been a mixture of sensationalism, wonder, and skepticism, changes overnight. The story is no longer a charming, mysterious folktale. It is a tragedy, a scandal, and the public needs someone to blame. The tide of public opinion, which can be so intoxicating when it flows in your favor, is terrifying when it turns against you. The same crowds that had once made the pilgrimage to El Let Her Nuid, leaving coins and prayers at Sarah's bedside, are now filled with righteous fury. The family, who had been elevated to the status of guardians of a living saint, are now recast as villains in a dark and sordid drama. The primary target of this outrage is, of course, Sarah's parents, Evan and Hannah Jacob. They are no longer seen as devout and simple farmers, but as cruel, greedy exploiters. The newspapers that had printed glowing portraits of the Welsh Fasting Girl now run editorials denouncing the criminal credulity and monstrous ignorance of her parents. They are accused of sacrificing their own daughter for the sake of notoriety and the meager profits from the collection box. The public's sympathy for the blessed child morphs into a furious pity, and that pity is weaponized against her family. But the blame doesn't stop with them. The local community, including the vicar, who had so fervently promoted the miracle, are also condemned. They are portrayed as a cabal of superstitious peasants, enabling a fatal delusion. The romantic image of the pure, faithful countryside is shattered, replaced by a picture of dangerous, backward ignorance. Then the finger of blame turns toward the medical men. Why did they agree to a watch that any first-year medical student would know could only have one outcome? They are accused of clinical coldness, of prioritizing a scientific experiment over the life of a child. The nurses too come in for criticism. How could they, women and caregivers, sit by and watch a little girl die? Their claims of simply following orders ring hollow to a public horrified by the outcome. This brings up a fascinating, albeit dark, aspect of social psychology: collective guilt and the need for a scapegoat. When a tragedy like this occurs, one that implicates not just individuals, but a whole system of belief and public fascination, the collective sense of guilt is immense. Everyone who bought a newspaper, who repeated the story, who felt a thrill of wonder, was a small participant in the spectacle. To assuage this collective guilt, society needs to find specific individuals to punish. By focusing all the blame on the parents or the doctors, the public can absolve itself of its own complicity in the affair. An autopsy is performed on Sarah's body, a grim necessity to establish the official cause of death. The findings are stark and unambiguous. There are no signs of any unusual disease. Her stomach is empty, her body emaciated. There are, however, small amounts of food found in her bowls, confirming that she had indeed been eating secretly prior to the start of the watch. The cause of death is declared with cold, scientific finality: starvation. There was no miracle, sad deception that ended when the deception was no longer possible. The great, lingering debate for historians is how to distribute this blame. Is it fair to lay it all at the feet of the uneducated, grieving parents? How much responsibility lies with the media that fanned the flames of the spectacle for profit? What about the doctors who designed and participated in the fatal experiment? And what about the wider public, whose insatiable appetite for marvels and miracles created the market for fasting girls in the first place? Uncomfortable web of responsibility, with no easy answers. The shock and condemnation reverberate through the press and the parlors of the nation. The beautiful, tragic story has curdled into a sordid and cautionary tale. The public fascination has turned to horror, and this horror demands justice. It's not enough to simply point fingers in the newspapers. The gears of the law begin to turn. The tragedy of El Let Her knew it is over, that the legal drama is just beginning. The public outcry for justice is too loud to ignore. The local coroner's inquest, after hearing the damning evidence from the autopsy and the nurse's logbooks, reaches a grim conclusion. They rule that Sarah Jacobs' death was caused by starvation, and that her parents, Evan and Hannah Jacob, were criminally responsible. Warrants are issued for their arrest on the charge of manslaughter. Imagine the scene: the same small farmhouse that had been a pilgrimage site is now the scene of a police investigation. The parents, already shattered by the death of their daughter, are now formally accused of killing her. They are taken into custody, leaving their remaining children in the care of relatives, and brought to the county gaol to await trial. The journey from local celebrities to accused criminals is complete, and it has been swift and brutal. The trial, held in the summer of 1870, is a national event. Journalists from London and across the country descend on the small Welsh town of Carmarthen. The courtroom is packed every day with a morbidly curious public. This is the moment where all the competing narratives, faith, science, parental love, deception, and public hysteria will be laid bare and subjected to the rigid logic of the law. We can sit in on this trial, as it were, and watch the prosecution build its case. They have a powerful arsenal of evidence. They have the nurse's meticulous records, charting Sarah's steady decline. They have the stark, irrefutable findings of the autopsy. They call the doctors to the stand, who testify that the parents were repeatedly warned of the fatal consequences of the watch and that they refused to intervene. The prosecution paints a clear picture. The parents knowingly and willfully withheld the food that would have saved their daughter's life, either through a criminal level of negligence or, more damningly, to protect their fraudulent story from being exposed. Then comes the defense. This is where the case becomes truly fascinating and tragic. The parent's lawyer doesn't try to argue that a miracle occurred. Instead, he builds a defense based on ignorance and belief. He portrays Evan and Hannah Jacob not as monstrous criminals, but as simple, uneducated, devoutly religious people who genuinely believed their daughter was special. They didn't mean to harm her, they were deluded. They were caught up in a hysteria that was not of their own making. A hysteria and by the present encouraged by their own religious leaders. Their lawyer also makes a powerful and controversial argument. He points the finger of blame directly back at the doctors. He argues that the doctors, by instituting the watch, had effectively taken control of the situation. The parents, he claims, were intimidated by these educated men from the city. They trusted the doctors to know what they were doing. Why, he asks the jury, would the doctors have proposed such a watch if they knew it would be fatal? The defense strategy is to spread the blame, to suggest that the parents were not the only ones responsible for this tragedy. Here we can touch on a quirky aspect of the Victorian legal system, the unsworn statement. At that time, defendants in a criminal trial were not allowed to give sworn testimony in their own defense, as they were considered too self-interested to be trusted under oath. This meant Evan and Hannah Jacob could not tell their own story to the jury. They had to sit in silence as their motives and actions were debated and interpreted by lawyers, witnesses, and the press. Their own voices were conspicuously, legally absent from their own trial. The central debate of the trial, and one that still echoes in historical analysis, is the question of intent versus outcome. The outcome was clear: a child was dead. But what was the parents' intent? Did they have mens rea, the guilty mind required for a criminal conviction? Or were they, as their defense argued, victims of their own profound, if misguided, faith? It's a question that pits the modern, secular logic of the law against the deeply ingrained, pre-scientific belief systems that still held powerful sway in many parts of the country. The jury, a group of local Welshmen, deliberates. They are caught between sympathy for the grieving, broken parents who are their neighbors and the cold, hard facts presented by the prosecution. After a tense wait, they return with a verdict. They find the father, Evan Jacob, guilty of manslaughter. The mother, Hannah, is acquitted, perhaps out of a sense of chivalry, or because the father was seen as the primary decision-maker. The judge sentences Evan Jacob to a year in prison with hard labor. The sentence is, by the standards of the day, relatively lenient, perhaps reflecting the judge's own acknowledgement of the complex and tragic circumstances. The trial is over. Justice of a sort has been served, but the verdict does little to resolve the deeper, more troubling questions about how and why a whole society could become complicit in the slow public death of a child. While the tragedy of Sarah Jacob was playing out in the public eye in Britain, the phenomenon of the fasting girl was not confined to one country. The same cultural and psychological forces were at work elsewhere. Now, let's shift our gaze across the Atlantic to the bustling, energetic, and often strange landscape of post-Civil War America. Here we meet another of the most famous fasting girls, a woman whose story is in some ways even more bizarre and complex than Sarah Jacobs. Her name is Mollie Fancher, and she will become known as the Brooklyn Enigma. Mollie's story begins in 1865, a few years before Sarah Jacobs' ordeal reached its climax. She is a young woman of about 18, living in a respectable part of Brooklyn, New York. Her early life was marked by tragedy. She was orphaned at a young age and raised by her aunt. She was, by all accounts, a bright and popular young woman, engaged to be married. But then a series of accidents derail her life. First, she is thrown from a horse. Then, a few months later, she is dragged for a block by a streetcar after her skirt gets caught in the door. Following these traumas, she takes to her bed, complaining of a host of debilitating symptoms. She says she has lost her sight, her hearing, and her ability to speak and move. And, most significantly for our story, she stops eating. She enters a state of what had, seemingly unconscious for long periods. Her case is diagnosed, in the familiar Victorian way, as a severe form of hysteria brought on by physical and emotional shock. For the next 9 years, Mollie Fancher lies in her bed, apparently blind, deaf, and paralyzed, and according to her caregivers, consuming no food at all, only tiny amounts of liquid. But here is where her story diverges dramatically from the simple piety of Sarah Jacob. Mollie's case isn't primarily about sainthood, it's about the supernatural and the paranormal. As her fast continues, she begins to exhibit a range of astonishing abilities. She develops what she calls secondary sight or mind reading. Lying in her bed, supposedly blind, she can reportedly read the contents of a sealed letter, describe the appearance of a stranger in another room, or know what her friends are doing miles away. She dictates poetry and prose, carries on complex intellectual conversations, and does intricate embroidery and wax flower arrangements, all supposedly without being able to see. Her bedroom in Brooklyn becomes a salon for the curious and the believers. Not just devout pilgrims, but scientists, paranormal investigators, journalists, and high society figures flock to witness the Brooklyn Enigma. She is a sensation. P.T. Barnum, the great American showman, who had a museum of freaks and curiosities in New York, hears of her and makes a lucrative offer to her family to exhibit her. Just as with you in our earlier story, the family indignantly refuses, a move that only enhances her mystique and perceived authenticity. The central debate among Mollie Fancher's observers was, as always, is she real? But the question was more complex than with Sarah Jacob. For Sarah, it was a simple binary miracle or fraud. For Mollie, there were more options. Was she a clever, calculating fraud? Was she genuinely psychic? Or was she a victim of a profound and complex mental illness, a dissociative state where different personalities emerged, some of whom could see and eat while her primary consciousness was unaware? Some doctors who examined her proposed a theory of multiple personalities, a very early forerunner of what would later be diagnosed as dissociative identity disorder. They noted that she seemed to have different selves with different abilities and memories. Sunray was a cheerful, childlike personality, while Idol was more intellectual and sophisticated. This theory provided a scientific explanation that was almost as sensational as the supernatural one. So while Sarah Jacob's story is a focused, intense tragedy about faith and starvation, Mollie Fancher's is a sprawling, decades-long mystery about consciousness, trauma, and the paranormal. Her fasting is just one part of a much larger, more elaborate performance of extraordinary abilities. Her story highlights how the fasting girl template could be adapted to fit different cultural anxieties and fascinations, from the religious piety of rural Wales to the spiritualist-obsessed parlors of urban America. Mollie Fancher took the basic premise of the girl in the bed and turned it into a grand, bewildering, and uniquely American spectacle. Mollie Fancher's case takes us far beyond the simple, albeit miraculous, claim of living without food. Her fasting becomes the bedrock upon which a much more elaborate and theatrical structure of paranormal abilities is built. It's as if her rejection of the physical world, symbolized by her refusal of food, has opened a door to the non-physical world of spirits and psychic phenomena. The list of her reported abilities is truly astonishing and reads like a catalogue of supernatural talents. First and foremost was her secondary sight. While her physical eyes were supposedly useless, she claimed to be able to see with the top of her forehead. Visitors would hold up a watch, and she would tell them the exact time. They would bring an unopened book, and she would read passages from it aloud. Skeptics tried to trick her, holding up blank cards or objects in the dark, but her supporters claimed she was never fooled. Then there was her supposed traveling mind. Lying in her Brooklyn bedroom, she would describe, in vivid detail, events happening miles away. She might recount the details of a friend's wedding reception as it was happening, or describe a fire breaking out in a distant part of the city. These visions were, of course, impossible to verify in the moment, but her followers would later collect testimonies claiming her descriptions were miraculously accurate. On top of this, she was said to possess a form of telepathy. She could allegedly sense people's thoughts and answer their unspoken questions. This was a particularly effective tool during her. A grieving visitor, thinking of their lost loved one, would be stunned when Mollie began to speak in a voice or mannerism that supposedly belonged to the deceased spirit, offering messages of comfort from beyond the grave. A very specific, and rather quaint, detail of her supposed powers was her skill in creating incredibly intricate crafts without the use of her eyes. She would produce complex embroidery, knit delicate lace, and create beautiful, lifelike flowers out of wax. These objects became her relics. Visitors would marvel at them, tangible proof of her extraordinary gifts. To receive a small, wax flower made by the blind hands of Mollie Fancher was a prized possession, a souvenir from the edge of human experience. This proliferation of powers leads to a fascinating schism among those who studied her. The spiritualists were all in. They saw her as one of the most powerful mediums of the age, a clear channel to the spirit world. Her fasting, her paralysis, her blindness, it was all part of a process of shedding her physical self to become a more perfect spiritual instrument. But the more scientifically minded observers, even those who were tempted to believe, were troubled. Her case was too messy, too spectacular. It wasn't just one miracle, it was a dozen. This is where the theory of multiple personalities, which we touched on before, became so important. It offered a way to believe in Mollie without resorting to the supernatural. A prominent physician, Dr. Jem Beard, a neurologist who studied her extensively, became a major proponent of this idea. He argued that Mollie's trance state allowed different, submerged parts of her consciousness to emerge. Perhaps one of these alternate personalities, one he might have called Mollie B, was not blind and was not paralyzed. This Mollie B could be the one doing the embroidery and reading the books, while the primary Mollie I remained in a genuine state of sensory deprivation. This psychological explanation is in many ways more unsettling than the supernatural one. It suggests a mind so fractured by trauma that it is splintered into separate, functioning parts. The great historical debate is whether Dr. Beard was accurately diagnosing a genuine psychological condition, or if he was simply imposing a new, fashionable scientific narrative onto a very clever and convincing performer. Was he a pioneer of psychology, or was he just another audience member? Captivated by the Brooklyn Enigma and trying to explain her magic with the tools he had, Mollie's story, with its ever-expanding list of wonders, shows how the Fasting Girl narrative could evolve. It wasn't a static performance. To maintain public interest over not just years, but decades, the show had to get bigger. The fasting was the opening act, the thing that drew the crowds in. But it was the clairvoyance, the mind reading, and the spirit messages that kept them coming back for more. Her body was still the stage, but the play being performed on it was becoming more spectacular and more unbelievable with every passing year. While the public was captivated by the dramatic sagas of Sarah Jacob and Mollie Fancher, a much quieter, less sensational revolution was taking place in the doctors' offices and lecture halls of London and Paris. A few forward-thinking physicians were beginning to look at girls who refused food not as saints, frauds as psychic marvels, but as patients suffering from a specific, definable illness. They were trying to peel back the layers of superstition and spectacle to find the medical reality underneath it. The key figure in this story is a British physician named Sir William Gull. In the 1870s, around the same time the Fancher case was gaining momentum and just after the Jacob tragedy, Gull presented two papers to the Clinical Society of London. In these papers, he described several cases of young women who exhibited a profound and willful refusal to eat, leading to extreme emaciation. He noted that this condition seemed to arise without any discernible physical cause. Their organs were healthy, they just wouldn't eat. Gull was a meticulous observer. He noted the typical age of onset, adolescence and early adulthood, the secretive nature of the behavior, the intense and morbid fear of gaining weight, and the strange, restless energy the patients often displayed despite their starved condition. He saw it not as a moral failing or a religious ecstasy, but as a morbid mental state. He wanted to give it a proper medical name, to pull it out of the realm of hysteria and give it its own identity. He coined the term anorexia nervosa, anorexia from the Greek for loss of appetite, and nervosa to signify its nervous or psychological origin. This was a radical act. By giving it a clinical, Latinized name, he was officially framing it as a medical pathology. He was telling his colleagues, this is a disease, and it is our job as doctors to understand and treat it. He was attempting to replace the narrative of the miracle with the narrative of illness. Almost simultaneously, a French physician named Ernest Charles Lossegg was observing the same phenomenon in Paris. He published his own paper, calling the condition l'anorexie hystérique while he still linked it to the broader concept of hysteria. His descriptions of the patients and their families were incredibly insightful. Lossegg was one of the first to describe the dysfunctional family dynamics that often surrounded the patient. He noted how the family would go from concern to pleading to anger to despair. He described the persecution the patient felt from her family's attempts to make her eat, and how the illness became the central, organizing principle of the entire household. He saw it not just as an individual's disease, but as a family's disease. Here's a small, fascinating detail about their clinical approach. Both Gull and Lossegg emphasized the importance of separating the patient from her family. They advocated for what we would now call milieu therapy. The patient would be removed from her home and placed under the care of a firm but compassionate nurse. The treatment involved a strict regimen of ray feeding, combined with moral support and encouragement, trying to break the cycle of performance and control that was happening in the home. The scholarly controversy here is a subtle but important one. Were Gull and Lossegg truly discovering a new disease? Or were they simply medicalizing a form of behavior that had existed for centuries? Critics point out that holy anorexia or anorexium aerobolus had been documented in female saints since the Middle Ages. What changed wasn't the behavior itself, but the lens through which it was viewed. In a secularizing, scientific age, the saint was reframed as the patient. The miracle was reframed as a symptom. The soul was replaced by the psyche. This shift in perspective was monumental, but it didn't happen overnight. The old narratives of sainthood and fraud didn't just vanish. For the rest of the 19th century, these three interpretations, the religious, the fraudulent, and the medical, existed side by side. A young woman who stopped eating could be seen as a saint by her local community, a fraud by the newspapers, and a case of anorexia nervosa by a progressive physician, all at the same time. But the work of Gull and Lossegg planted a seed. It provided a new language, a new framework for understanding this baffling, untragic behavior. It was the beginning of a long, slow journey toward recognizing that the prison of the fasting girl was not always built of piety or deceit, but sometimes of a profound and powerful mental illness. The key wasn't to test the miracle or expose the fraud, but to treat the patient. It was a paradigm shift that would take decades to fully take hold, but its origins can be traced back to these quiet, clinical observations, far from the glare of the public spotlight. So we stand at a crossroads, looking back at these pale, captivating figures in their dimly lit Victorian bedrooms. And the central, most persistent question remains: what were they? Were they cunning frauds, or were they tragic victims of a mental illness we are only just beginning to name? This is not just a historical debate, it gets to the very heart of how we understand human motivation, belief, and suffering. Let's step into the shoes of those who argue for fraud. Their case is straightforward and compelling. Who comes under the bed? The dumbwaiters and the loyal sisters. The autopsy of Sarah Jacob, which proved she'd been eating prior to the watch. Look at the money. The collection boxes, the paid admissions, the offers from P.T. Barnum. These were profitable enterprises. The fasting girl, in this view, is a savvy, if ruthless, entrepreneur of the sacred. She is a performer who understood her audience perfectly and gave them exactly the miracle they wanted, all while secretly sustaining herself. She is the 19th century equivalent of a modern-day social media influencer staging a fake spiritual retreat for clicks and cash. This perspective sees the fasting girl as an active agent, a rational actor making a calculated choice. Perhaps it was a way to escape an unwanted marriage. Perhaps it was a way to achieve a level of fame and influence utterly unattainable for a young woman of her time. In a world that gave her no power, she seized it through a bold and daring deception. This viewpoint doesn't necessarily make her a monster, it can even frame her as a kind of subversive trickster, manipulating the foolish piety of her era for her own ends. Now, let's walk over to the other side and listen to those who argue for mental illness. Their case is more compassionate, and perhaps more complex. They look at the same girl and see not a cunning actress, but a deeply tormented individual. They see the undeniable parallels between her behavior and the clinical descriptions of anorexia nervosa, the intense fear of food, the distorted body image, seeing herself as healthy or pure when she was wasting away, the sense of control and empowerment derived from self-denial, From this perspective, the performance of sainthood isn't a cynical trick, it's a delusion. It's a culturally sanctioned narrative that gives meaning to her otherwise inexplicable and terrifying compulsion to starve. Her society didn't have the language of psychiatry, so it used the language it had: religion and miracles. She wasn't consciously trying to fool anyone, she was trying to fool anyone. She was trying to make sense of the powerful, irrational forces raging within her own mind. Is not proof of fraud, but a tragic symptom of the illness itself, a desperate, guilt-ridden capitulation to the body's survival instinct, which only deepens her sense of spiritual failure and reinforces her need to fast even more strictly. Here's a specific, modern concept that can be retroactively applied here: the idea of a culture-bound syndrome. This is a psychological condition that manifests in ways that are specific to a particular culture. The argument is that anorexia nervosa might be a universal condition, but in the 19th century, it expressed itself through the fasting girl phenomenon because that was the available cultural script. The desire for purity, control, and either reality found its voice in the persona of the living saint. The great, unresolved academic debate is whether these two explanations, fraud and mental illness, are mutually exclusive. The answer is almost certainly no. The reality for most of these girls was likely a messy, tragic combination of both. A girl might have begun fasting due to a genuine psychological distress, a nascent eating disorder. Then, as she received attention and praise for her piety, the performance aspect would kick in. She would lean into the role, perhaps embellishing her story, enjoying the power it gave her. The secret eating could be both a desperate act of survival and a conscious part of a deception. The motives could shift from day to day, hour to hour. She could be both a victim of her own mind and a manipulator of her audience. This is what makes these stories so endlessly fascinating and so profoundly human. There is no single easy answer. The fasting girl is not just a saint, a fraud, or a patient. She is a complex amalgam of all three, a figure trapped at the intersection of her own internal struggles and the immense pressures of the world she lived in. To try and label her as just one of these things is to miss the heartbreaking complexity of her story. To truly understand why the fasting girl phenomenon took root and flourished, we need to pull the camera back even further. We need to look away from the individual girls in their beds and examine the suffocating atmosphere of the world that created them. The Victorian era, for all its industrial progress and imperial confidence, had a deeply troubled and contradictory relationship with women, their bodies, and their appetite. The ideal woman of the time, as we touched on at the beginning, was the angel in the house. This wasn't just a poetic fancy, it was a powerful social blueprint. This ideal angel was delicate, gentle, and above all, pure. Her defining characteristic was her selflessness. She was expected to have no desires of her own, to exist solely for the comfort and moral uplift of her husband and children. Appetite, in all its forms, was seen as dangerously unfeminine. A healthy, robust appetite for food was considered coarse and animalistic. A hearty laugh was unladylike. And, of course, any hint of sexual appetite was the ultimate taboo, a stain on her essential purity. The female body itself was a site of anxiety. Doctors and moralists of the era wrote extensively about the inherent weakness and frailty of the female constitution. Women were seen as being perpetually on the verge of illness, their delicate nervous systems easily overwhelmed. Their reproductive systems were thought to dominate their entire being, making them prone to emotional instability and irrationality, hence the all-encompassing diagnosis of hysteria. This medical view reinforced the social ideal. A woman was a creature to be protected, controlled, and confined to the domestic sphere, lest the harsh realities of the world shatter her fragile nature. Fashion, as always, reflected and reinforced these ideals. The corset, which we've already felt cinched around our ribs, was the most obvious tool. It physically molded women into the era's ideal shape: a tiny waist, a full bust and hips, but it also restricted their breathing and movement, literally embodying the social restrictions placed upon them. It made it difficult to eat a large meal or to engage in any strenuous activity. The ideal of beauty was one of delicate, almost sickly fragility. A pale complexion suggesting a life lived indoors, away from the vulgar sun and manual labor, was highly prized. Women would even sometimes discreetly ingest small amounts of arsenic to achieve a fashionable, pallid look, a weird and toxic little beauty secret of the age. In this context, the fasting girl becomes the ultimate expression of the feminine ideal. She takes it to its most extreme and logical conclusion. If a small appetite is the pinnacle of femininity, if delicacy is beautiful, then emaciation is divine. If self-denial is a woman's greatest virtue, then she is the most virtuous woman of all. She is the angel in the house made flesh, an angel so pure that she has transcended the messy, inconvenient needs of that flesh altogether. She is the perfect embodiment of a patriarchal society's fantasy of the ideal woman, silent, still, desireless, and confined to her bed, causing no trouble at all. This is why her community didn't immediately see her as sick. Her behavior, while extreme, was in perfect alignment with the values they cherished. She was simply doing what all good women were supposed to do, denying herself, but she was doing it better than anyone else. The academic controversy that spins out of this is a feminist one. Is it possible to see the fasting girl not just as a victim, but as a rebel? In a world that sought to control every aspect of her life, her education, her finances, her marriage, her body, the refusal of food was the one form of protest she had left. It was a passive, but incredibly powerful no. It was a way of saying, you may control everything else about me, but you will not control what crosses my lips, but I hold the key to the cell door. From this perspective, the fasting girl's bed is not just a stage for a miracle, it's a site of resistance. Her self-starvation is a desperate, tragic, but nonetheless defiant political act. It's a hunger strike against the patriarchy, waged by its most outwardly compliant daughters. Whether this was a conscious act of rebellion is, of course, highly debatable and probably varied from girl to girl. But it offers a powerful framework for understanding how such a self-destructive act could also be, in a twisted way, an act of self-assertion. She was a prisoner of the feminine ideal, yes, but by becoming its most perfect embodiment, she also exposed its grotesque and lethal absurdity. Like all strange fevers, the cultural obsession with fasting girls eventually broke. By the turn of the 20th century, you would be hard-pressed to find a newspaper running a breathless front-page story about a new fasting marvel. The phenomenon, which had burned so brightly for a few decades, seemed to simply fade away. It receded from the headlines and slipped into the footnotes of history. So what happened? Why did the world stop believing in fasting girls? There wasn't a single, dramatic event that ended it all. It was more like a slow, steady erosion, a death by 1,000 small changes. The most significant factor was, without a doubt, the advance of science and education. The tragic, highly publicized death of Sarah Jacob had a chilling effect. It was a brutal, public demonstration of a simple, scientific fact: people who do not eat die. The verdict in her parents' trial legally codified this fact, moving starvation out of the realm of divine mystery and into the category of criminal negligence. It became much harder for communities and the press to champion a new fasting girl when the ghost of Sarah Jacob loomed so large. At the same time, the medical narrative, championed by doctors like William Garn, the term anorexia nervosa, while not yet a household name, was entering the medical lexicon. As more doctors were trained to recognize the condition as a psychological illness, they were less likely to be baffled or to declare it a miracle. They had a framework, a diagnosis. This meant that a girl who stopped eating was more likely to be seen as a patient in need of treatment rather than a saint in need of veneration. The authority of the doctor was gradually but surely eclipsing the authority of the local vicar in these matters. The world itself was changing at a dizzying pace. The late Victorian and Edwardian eras were a time of new technologies, new ideas and new anxieties. The public's appetite for wonders began to be fed by different sources. Why be amazed by a girl who doesn't eat when you could be amazed by the electric light bulb, the telephone, the automobile, or the moving picture? The automobile or the moving picture. Science and technology were producing real, tangible miracles every day. Medieval-style miracle of the fasting girl started to look a bit quaint, a bit old-fashioned, a relic of a more credulous age. A fascinating and slightly quirky contributor to this decline was the rise of a new field, professional magic and debunking. This was the era of great stage magicians like Harry Houdini, who made a career out of performing incredible feats and then, crucially, exposing fraudulent spiritualists and mediums. Houdini and others like him dedicated themselves to showing the public how easily they could be fooled. They published articles and gave lectures demonstrating the tricks of the trade. This created a more skeptical, savvy public. People became more aware of concepts like trickery, mysterium, and mass hysteria. The idea that the fasting girl might just be a very clever trickster, using methods similar to those of a fraudulent medium, became a much more plausible explanation for the man on the street. The role of women in society was also beginning to undergo a seismic shift. The angel in the house ideal was starting to crack under the pressure of the burgeoning women's suffrage movement. The new woman was emerging, a figure who was educated, politically active, and who rode a bicycle. She was anything but pale, passive, and confined to her bed. In this new climate, the image of the weak, starving, saintly girl lost much of its cultural resonance. She was no longer the feminine ideal. She was starting to look like a symbol of the very oppression the new woman was fighting against. The debate among historians isn't really if these factors led to the decline, but rather which one was the most important. Was it the hard lesson of the Sarah Jacob case? Was it the quiet work of medical science? Or was it the noisy march of modernity and feminism that simply made the fasting girl obsolete? The most likely answer is that it was the convergence of all these forces. The cultural ecosystem that had allowed the fasting girl to thrive, a mixture of intense religious piety, scientific ignorance, public credulity, and a repressive feminine ideal was disappearing, and so the fasting girl quietly exited the stage. The pilgrims stopped coming, the newspapers found new sensations, and the girls themselves were either treated or their stories were forgotten. The phenomenon became a historical curiosity, a strange and unsettling chapter in the story of the 19th century, a cautionary tale about the dangers of belief when it becomes untethered from reason and compassion. Now that we've journeyed through the rise and fall of this strange phenomenon, let's take a final step back. Let's try to look at these girls not as saints, or frauds, or patients, or even as celebrities, but through one final, powerful lens, as rebels. Let's reconsider the act of fasting not as a symptom or a trick, but as a tool. A desperate, dangerous, and ultimately self-destructive tool, but a tool nonetheless. Imagine yourself back in that corset in that dimly lit room. Your entire life is prescribed for you. Your education is designed to make you a pleasing, but not too challenging, companion. Your body is an object to be preserved and passed on to a husband who will be chosen for you based on social and economic convenience. Your opinions are to be kept to yourself. Your opinions are to be kept to yourself. You are in a very real sense a possession. You have no voice, no vote, no financial independence, no control over your own destiny. In this landscape of total powerlessness, what do? How do you scream when you have been taught your whole life to be silent? How do you fight back when you have no weapons? You turn to the one thing you have left, the one sovereign territory that no one can truly conquer without your consent, your own body. Specifically, the boundary between your body and the world, your mouth. The refusal to eat becomes the ultimate act of self-determination. It is a declaration of independence waged on the battlefield of the dinner plate. This reframes the entire story. The fasting girl is no longer a passive figure, being acted upon by her family, her community, her doctors. She is the protagonist of her own tragic story. Her self-denial is not a sign of weakness, it's a terrifying display of willpower. In a world that demands she be soft and compliant, she becomes hard, rigid, and unyielding. Her emaciation is not just a sign of illness, it is a visible, shocking testament to her resolve. Her starving body becomes her political statement, a silent, public protest against the conditions of her existence. Let's consider a rather unusual but relevant piece of 20th century history: the hunger strikes of the suffragettes. In the early 1900s, just as the fasting girl phenomenon was fading, imprisoned women fighting for the right to vote began systematically refusing food. Their goal was to protest their imprisonment and to force the government to recognize them as political prisoners. Their bodies became their banners. The government responded with the brutal practice of force feeding. This comparison is striking. The suffragettes consciously and politically deployed the same weapon that the fasting girls had, perhaps unconsciously and personally, wielded decades earlier. It highlights the long and troubling history of women using self-starvation as a tactic of last resort against an oppressive system. From this perspective, the miracle narrative and the family's complicity take on a new meaning. Perhaps the family on some level understood her silent protest. They couldn't acknowledge it as a rebellion that would be too scandalous. But they could rebrand it as piety. The language of sainthood became a safe, socially acceptable way to talk about their daughter's radical and terrifying act of defiance. It allowed them to support her, to give her a stage, without having to confront the uncomfortable truth of what she was protesting against, the very structure of their world. The academic debate here is a nuanced one. Can we really call it a rebellion if the girls themselves didn't articulate it that way? Is it anachronistic to project modern feminist ideas of resistance onto these 19th century girls? Many historians would argue yes, that we must be careful not to romanticize their suffering or turn them into conscious political agents they never claimed to be. But others would argue that resistance doesn't always have a manifesto. It doesn't always shout its name. Sometimes it is quiet, personal, and deeply pathological. The fasting girls' rebellion was not a healthy or effective one. It was a protest that ultimately destroyed the protester. But to deny the element of resistance, to see her only as a passive victim of illness or delusion, is perhaps to do her a final injustice. It is to ignore the ferocious, albeit misguided, strength it took to say no in a world that demanded nothing but her yes. It was a terrible, tragic, and ultimately fatal strategy, but it may have been the only one she had. And so, we gently begin to pull away from the 19th century. The gas lamps flicker out, the smell of coal smoke and damp wool fades, and the rustle of petticoats grows quiet. But the story isn't over. The ghosts of these girls, with their hollow eyes and fierce, silent willpower, don't just stay in the past. They travel with us. Their stories echo, sometimes with a shocking clarity, in the world we live in right now. The most direct and obvious echo is, of course, in the continued prevalence of eating disorders. Anorexia nervosa, the condition Sir William Gall gave a name to, did not disappear with the Victorian era. It is still with us, a persistent and devastating illness that affects millions of people, predominantly young women. The clinical symptoms are uncannily similar: the intense fear of gaining weight, the distorted body image, the sense of empowerment derived from restriction. The core psychological struggle remains the same. What has changed is the cultural costume the illness wears. The Victorian girl starved to become a saint, to achieve a state of ethereal purity and desirelessness. Today, a young person might be starving themselves to achieve a different kind of perfection, one dictated not by religious tracts, but by social media feeds, fashion magazines, and celebrity culture. The goal is no longer to be a sleeping saint, but to have a thigh gap, a bikini bridge, or to fit into a size 00. The external pressures have changed, the language is different, but the underlying mechanism, the attempt to gain control, to feel worthy, to sculpt an identity through the manipulation of the body, is hauntingly familiar. Think about the modern pro-anorexia websites and online communities. These are secret, digital spaces where individuals encourage each other's eating disorders. They share inspiration photos, often disturbingly emaciated bodies, exchange tips on how to hide weight loss from their families, and treat fasting not as a medical problem, but as a lifestyle choice, a mark of superior willpower and dedication. These online forums are the modern-day equivalent of the pilgrims' circle around the fasting girl's bed. They are communities built around the veneration of self-starvation, creating a shared narrative that validates and encourages the pathology. And what about the element of celebrity and spectacle? The fasting girls became famous through penny dreadfuls and illustrated newspapers. Today, social media influencers build entire brands around their bodies, their diets, and their workout regimens. The "What I Eat in a Day" video is a staple of YouTube and TikTok. While most of these are presented under the guise of health and wellness, they can create immense pressure, promoting unrealistic and sometimes dangerously restrictive eating habits. The public's fascination with observing, judging, and emulating the dietary habits of others is more intense now than it ever was in the 19th century. We are all, in a way, watching each other eat or not eat. Here we can touch upon a modern cultural quirk, the clean eating movement. On the surface, it's about health, avoiding processed foods, sugar, gluten, etc. But for some, it can morph into a condition known as orthorexia, an obsession with pure or correct eating that can become just as socially isolating and physically dangerous as anorexia. The language is all about purity, cleansing, and detoxification. It's not hard to see the faint echo of the Victorian desire for spiritual purity in the modern quest for a clean, uncontaminated body. The academic debate today often revolves around this very question: to what extent is social pressure, amplified by media, responsible for the prevalence of body image issues and eating disorders? Are platforms like Instagram and TikTok creating a new generation of fasting girls, performing a new kind of public piety for a digital audience? Or are they simply providing a new stage for a pre-existing psychological vulnerability? The answer, as with the Victorians, is likely a complex interplay of both. The world has changed immeasurably since Sarah Jacob lay in her bed. We have a medical language for her condition. We have therapies and support groups. We understand the psychology in ways her doctors could only dream of. And yet, we are still haunted by the same fundamental struggle: the pressure to conform to an ideal of bodily perfection, and the desperate, often destructive measures people will take to feel in control of their own skin. The mirror in our modern world may be a smartphone screen instead of a silver-backed looking glass, but the ghosts in its reflection look and Ingorm familiar. And so here we are. You can feel the faint vibration of the modern world through the floorboards, the low hum of your phone sitting on the nightstand, a portal back to your own time. But let's not leave just yet. Let's stay here in this quiet, dimly lit Victorian room for one final moment. You've been the dutiful daughter, the local wonder, the celebrated saint, the suspected fraud, the medical specimen, and the national headline. You've lived inside this story. Slowly, you sit up in the bed. There are no pilgrims watching, no nurses taking notes. The air is still and silent. For the first time in what feels like an eternity, you are not performing. You are just you. You are just you. Your body feels impossibly light, a fragile collection of bones held together by a fierce, tired will. You look at your hands, pale and thin in the sliver of moonlight coming through the gap in the curtains. They are the hands that accepted the veneration, that hid the crumbs that lay still in a perfect tableau of piety. You swing your legs over the side of the bed. The floorboards are cold, a sharp, grounding reality. You stand up, and the room doesn't spin. You feel a flicker of a new kind of strength, one that doesn't come from defiance or denial, but from a simple decision. You are hungry, and for the first time, you allow yourself to fully feel it, not as a secret shame, not as an enemy to be conquered, but as a simple one, a signal from a body that wants to live. You walk out of the bedroom. No one stops you. You glide down the main staircase, your hand trailing along the polished banister. The house is a museum of a life you are about to leave behind. In the kitchen, the embers in the hearth are still glowing. On the table, left out from the family's dinner, is a loaf of bread and a small wedge of cheese. It's the plainest of foods. It is everything you need. You pick up the bread. It feels solid, real, in your hand. You tear a piece off. The sound is loud in the silence. You bring it to your lips. There is no guilt. There is no fear. There is no fear. There is no fear. There is only the starchy, wholesome taste of sustenance. You take a bite of cheese, sharp and salty. It's an explosion of flavor in a world that had become tasteless. This is not a secret, frantic act of survival. This is a conscious, deliberate choice. This is you, reclaiming yourself, one mouthful at a time. This is the real miracle. There is a strange, sad detail about some of the real fasting girls who were rescued. Having starved for so long, their bodies sometimes couldn't handle the reintroduction of food, a medical condition we now call refining syndrome. It's a final, tragic irony. The very thing that could save them could also be dangerous. It underscores that waking up from this nightmare was never a simple or easy process. You leave the rest of the bread on the table and walk to the front door. You turn the heavy iron key in the lock, and the mechanism groans in protest. You pull the door open and step outside. The night air is cool and clean. But the world is different. The gas lamps on the street have been replaced by the steady, orange glow of electric street lighted. The cobblestones have given way to smooth asphalt. The distant clatter of horses has been replaced by the gentle hum of a car passing in the distance. You have walked out of the 19th century and into your own. You look back at the house one last time. It's just a building now. The stage is dark. The audience has gone home. The great final question that historians and all of us are left with is one of narrative. Who gets to write your story? For so long, your story was written by your family, your church, your doctors, the newspapers. They turned you into a saint, a freak, a fraud, a case study. Now, you've taken the pen back. You've walked out of their story and started writing your own. The first line was a simple one, written with a piece of bread and cheese. I will not be a symbol. I will be alive. And you walk away down the quiet modern street, leaving the ghosts of the past to their restless sleep, the quiet reflection. And so our journey is done. The story is told. Let the details begin to soften now, the sharp edges of the 19th century blurring unfading into the quiet darkness of your own room. The echoes of those old voices, the pilgrims, the doctors, the weeping mothers are growing faint, dissolving into the gentle, steady hum of the fan or the silence of the night. Feel the weight of your own blanket, the simple, solid comfort of your own bed. The space is not a shrine. It is just a place of rest. Your body, lying here, is not a statement or a spectacle. It is just yours, breathing quietly, in undoubt. A simple, wonderful biological fact. There is nothing to prove, nothing to perform. You can let the characters go now. Let Sarah Jacob and Mollie Fancher and all the other pale, nameless girls finally rest. Their long, exhausting performance is over. Let all the questions, the debates, the whys and the hows, just drift away like smoke. They will be there tomorrow if you want them, but they are not needed for tonight. You are drifting now on the slow, easy current that pulls us from wakefulness to sleep. The river is dark and calm. Let it carry you. Let the story become a dream, and then let the dream dissolve into the deep, quiet peace of a good night's rest. There is only stillness now, only warmth, only sleep. The end of the article. Good night.